All right. The Public Religion Research Institute released a detailed study earlier this month on the religious affiliations of people in America. And what has stood out most is how there are now reportedly more white mainline Protestants than white evangelical Protestants for the first time since at least 2006. Now, before you jump to conclusions, there are several items that should be considered. I will tell you what I think this is, and then we'll get the opinion of the expert here in a moment. But I actually wrote about this in a book I wrote probably about 15 years ago with the late Bishop Harry Jackson, Personal Faith, Public Policy. And I went back all the way back to the start of what we would call the modern moral majority, back to the 1980s, when soon as that was Dr. Jerry Falwell who began that. And it was like every cycle you would see these articles that were talking about how the religious right is losing its influence. It can't get organized. It went through the Reagan administration, post-Reagan administration. In fact, I've got a couple of the articles here. Right after Thanksgiving in 1990, the Washington Post ran this headline: "Bloom is off religious right. Scholars at conference agree. Movement criticized for lacking political finesse." It went on to say the religious right has fallen on hard times, torn by sectarian divisions, hindered by the uneasiness of some in its ranks with coalition building, and on it goes. And that continues. You might recall this one. This was a famous one for those who've been around. This was in February 1st of 1993. It was 3 years after that. When the movement didn't go away, they had this is that article in the Washington Post that said that the religious right, largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command, how they describe this. And it goes on. I mean, every election cycle, we see this. So I'm not surprised by this at all. Not to say that there's not change going on. I do think there is change, but I think you got to be very careful what is read into these numbers. Joining me now to talk more about this is George Barna, Senior Fellow with FRC Center for Biblical Worldview. George, welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you, Tony.
All right, you know something about numbers, and you know how numbers can be used. You know the questions that can be asked. Is there a pattern that we see where I'm not denying there's some movement, there's some changes. That's always happening. But is there a pattern out there that's just trying to discourage Christians, saying that their numbers are dwindling, they're falling off, their influence is decreasing, so just give it up?
You know, Tony, I think that a lot of research is kind of like lies, in that when you look at an effective lie, it mixes truth and deceit. And so I think sometimes we see numbers that may be accurate statistically speaking, but it is because of the sample that was chosen, or it's because of the way that questions were asked, or the sequence within which questions were asked, or a number of other things that are part of the whole research design process. And so you literally could get pretty much any answer you want if you were willing to skew the process. Now, I'm not saying that PRRI skewed the process. I will say that having read a variety of their studies over the last 20 years, from my vantage point, their analyses tend to skew a bit to the left. So this doesn't surprise me. And of course, when you look at how they measure things, I think there are two kind of questions we need to be asking about their measurements. Number one, are they asking the same questions the same way over the course of time? That's right. One of the things that you need to have in order to compare over time. And to their credit, yes, I think they have been asking the same questions. The second thing you've got to look at, though, is are they asking the right questions? And this is where I think we have some issues because, for example, we know that in their studies, when they talk about mainliners, they're talking about anybody who claims to be Protestant and who does not claim to be either born again or evangelical by self-report. Two issues there. One is that it's self-report, which has a lot of problems that we could talk about. But the other is that that's not really how you define a mainline Protestant Christian, by simply saying, okay, if you do not have this particular quality, we're going to call you a mainliner. So I think there are some issues with the way that things are being measured here, and perhaps with some of the analysis as well.
Well, in terms, I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot of times. Even the term evangelical has changed over the last decade, last two decades. And in fact, even male and female, that has changed over the last couple of decades. So everything's changing. But let me go back to, I probably should have done this before I jumped into my criticism of the poll, but let me just, overall, this is what the poll says. Americans' religiosity overall has declined significantly in recent years, but even against that backdrop, the decline is sizable. Over this span, white evangelical Christians' share of the population has declined by 37%, compared with 8% for white non-evangelical Protestants and 27% for white Catholics. The decline is also very notably continued over the past 3 years, despite a slight rebound in these other groups. The result, there are now more white non-evangelical Protestants than evangelical ones for the first time since the last one in 2006. So let's go back to the terms, and that's why we use the term when we're looking for sage cons, spiritually active, governance engaged. You know, we're looking for definitions. We're looking for titles, for labels, whatever you want to call them, that actually define something. Evangelical has become so elastic. Many people have jettisoned it. I don't know that I don't use the term to describe myself as evangelical. I describe myself as a follower of Jesus Christ. And so I think I'm not denying that there's some changes that are happening. And I think the church has to do more in terms of evangelism. But I also think some people, when you do self-reporting, are describing themselves in a different way that's not being measured correctly.
Well, and to that point, Tony, I mean, for years, when I had the Barna Research Group, and then when I sold that and started doing research independently, and now at the Cultural Research Center, I never ask people whether or not they consider themselves to be born again or whether they think they're evangelicals, unless I simply want to compare that to those people who I think actually do meet those criteria. But the criteria isn't about self-report. It has to be about what you believe and how you live. And so, probably a good 35 years ago, I started defining evangelicals based on what the National Association of Evangelicals said were the hallmarks of evangelical churches. And so it had to do with their belief in and their trust in the Bible as being the accurate word of God. It had to be with the definition of who God is, the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe who still rules it today. Being born again, no, it has to do with what do you think will happen to you after you die and why. And so we have more detailed questions that we ask. When I use a series of 7 questions that come out of NAE's statement of faith, what we discover is that only about 6 to maybe 7% of the adult population should be classified as evangelical Christians. Now, compare that to what a place like PRRI or many other research firms get by simply saying, do you consider yourself to be evangelical or born again? And by the way, they combine the two, which is another error. But, they'll come up with 30 to 35%, which I would estimate is probably 5 to 6 times more than we actually have in the United States. So there's a lot of noise in that measurement simply by allowing people to define what the term means.
All right. In post 2016, after the election, you wrote a book about how, and help me with the title, The Day That Christians
Changed America. Right.
Yeah.
The Day Christians Changed America.
And that was their influence of living out their faith. It was the sage cons. It was those people that were out there that from their faith were engaged. Tell me how in 4 short years we could go to where this was a influential group of people that continued to be here, and I think have expanded their numbers to some degree, went from being an influencer to now being on life support, which would, this is the type of narrative we get from this. And of course, I'll jump ahead. What's been written about this poll is that evangelicals have left the faith because of the engagement of evangelicals with Donald Trump, is the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean that's a big jump that frankly the data doesn't support. Those are two very different tracks of activity, and we don't see that in the research that we've been doing. If anything, we kind of see the opposite. So, I think there are some significant changes that are happening because of generational shifts, and so it is true that millennials are much less likely to be evangelical. They're much less likely to be born again. They're much less likely to have a biblical worldview. They're much less likely to attend church. So those are real issues that as the Church of Jesus Christ, we've got to address those issues. But then to jump ahead and say, and because of that, or what some sociologists would call the browning of America, meaning that, you've got the Black population, the Asian population, and the Hispanic population that are growing, while the proportion of our population that's white is decreasing. So that may have some impact as well. Absolutely. But let's not conflate these various elements that we want to measure.
Well, let me just stop you. Let me stop you right there, because I want to go, because this was an issue in this last election where we see Hispanic and Black Americans leaving the Democratic Party because of their liberal social policy. So I'm finding very interesting that they just want to segregate white evangelicals because, and again, I don't like the term evangelical because I don't think it's accurate, but followers of Christ are not just white. You've got Black, you've got Hispanic, and when they come together, it's a much bigger number than what the media and others want to report.
Yeah, I think clearly there are a lot of measurement issues related to how the data were put together. And, earlier you even mentioned that Washington Post report, I think it was, talked about the fact that there was a 37% decline. Well, that's one way of putting it. The other way of putting it was there's an 8 percentage point decline. Now, which one is more likely to grab your attention? Taking a small number and a small shift and dividing, one small number into another small number and coming up with a big number, or simply recognizing that, yeah, there's been a decline if you're going to mismeasure it the way that it's being measured. But even then, that decline has been 8 percentage points, not nearly as dramatic as, 37% decline sounds.
Okay, George Barna, we just got a couple minutes left. And I'm not disputing at all that we have change taking place. Things are always changing. And I agree with you. We've got an issue with millennials and the Gen Zers and whatever else we're calling them down there now. The reality is we're not doing a good job of building worldview and passing our faith along as parents. And I'm using that universally. I'm intentional in that. And we've got to be intentional. What do we need to be doing? And this is apart from politics. I don't care about the politics. That takes care of itself if we take care of the heart issues and the faith issues.
Well, that's a much longer discussion, but part of it is that what we find is people who are leaving evangelical churches are doing so because they say it appears that their church is more interested in numerical growth than in the spiritual depth of the people in those churches. And so in the last 2 election cycles, we found enormous numbers of people in those kinds of churches who were saying, I don't want my pastor to tell me who to vote for, but I'm dying for my pastor to teach me how to think biblically about the issues. What does the Bible say about immigration, about crime, about any number of different issues? And our research with the pastors showed that most pastors say, well, I know the Bible speaks to those issues, but I'm not going to. Too controversial. We're going to lose people. It's only going to cause conflict in the community. And so at some point, we're going to have to put on our big boy pants and say, you know what, let's talk about what the Bible really says about these issues and figure out whether we're serious or not about following Jesus Christ.
Well, I can't speak to it scientifically, but I can speak to it anecdotally that those churches over the last year, year and a half, when many were closed, those that were open preaching the word have exploded. Because I think you're absolutely right. I think people are looking for the truth. They want to know, how do we interpret? How do we understand what's happening in the world around us? And that's what we're doing at our Center for Biblical Worldview, which you're a part of, and excited about what's happening there. And George, thanks so much for joining us today. Always great to talk with you.
Thank you, Tony.